From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The President believes, and I believe, that those who use chemical weapons against defenseless men, women, and children should and must be held accountable.
As the United States and Britain prepare to strike Syria, international opposition mounts. Russia warns a strike could destabilize Syria and the region. We'll speak with Phyllis Bennis of the Institute for Policy Studies. Then, after decades of protest, the Vermont Yankee nuclear power plant is shutting down. We'll speak with former nuclear industry executive Arnie Gundersen. Then, 50 years ago today, hundreds of thousands filled the National Mall in Washington for the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom.
I have the pleasure to present to you Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I am happy to join with you today in what will go down in history as the greatest demonstration for freedom in the history of man.
We'll play excerpts of the rarely seen Oscar-nominated documentary King, a filmed record, Montgomery to Memphis. The film was originally shown in 1970 on one night for 3 hours in 650 theaters. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Britain is set to introduce a United Nations Security Council resolution authorizing military action in Syria as the U.S. and allies gear up for expected strikes on the Assad regime. The British resolution condemns the Syrian government for allegedly using chemical weapons in Ghouta last week and authorizes, quote, necessary measures for protecting civilians. Russia's expected to issue a veto. The measure is being introduced as the Obama administration moves closer to launching airstrikes on Syria, with reports suggesting an attack within days. At the White House, Press Secretary Jay Carney said the U.S. isn't seeking regime change, but an appropriate response to the use of chemical weapons.
The options that we are considering are not about regime change. They are about responding to a clear violation of an international standard that prohibits the use of chemical weapons.
The Syrian regime has denied using chemical weapons. A UN team has resumed its visit to Ghouta today for a second day of inspections. We'll have more on Syria after headlines. At least 44 people have been killed and nearly 160 wounded in a series of bombings in the Iraqi capital of Baghdad. It's the second deadliest attack in Iraq this month after Sunday's violence that left 47 dead. More than 1,000 people were killed in Iraq last month, the highest monthly toll since 2008. One of the country's oldest and most controversial nuclear plants has announced it'll close late next year. On Tuesday, the nuclear plant operator Entergy said it plans to decommission the Vermont Yankee nuclear power station in Vernon, Vermont. The site has been the target of protests for decades and has had a series of radioactive tritium leaks. We'll have more on its closure and its significance for the nation later in the broadcast. Low-wage workers at fast food and retail chains across the country are gearing up for a nationwide strike Thursday. Organizers expect workers to walk off the job in 35 cities in a pre-Labor Day call for a living wage and the right to unionize. Thursday's action is expected to be the largest so far in a campaign that kicked off last November at fast food restaurants in New York City. For the first time, strikes will be held in southern and western coast cities, including Los Angeles, Memphis, and Raleigh. A former El Salvador military colonel linked to war crimes has been sentenced to 21 months in prison for immigration fraud in the United States. Inocente Orlando Montano admitted to lying about his background on his immigration forms and agreed not to contest deportation back to El Salvador. A United Nations inquiry has named him as among the top military officials who approved the murder plot that led to the 1989 slaying of 6 Jesuit priests, their housekeeper, and the housekeeper's daughter. The Jesuits had been outspoken advocates for the poor and critics of human rights abuses committed by the Arena government. Montano lived in Boston for about a decade before his 2011 arrest. Prosecutors say he came to the U.S. in part to avoid being brought to justice for the Jesuits' murders. He is among 20 Salvadoran officials who've been indicted by a Spanish court and could face extradition to Spain upon his release. The UN's top expert on torture is criticizing California's force-feeding of hunger-striking prisoners protesting solitary confinement and other harsh conditions. In a statement, Juan Mendez, the independent United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, said solitary confinement, quote, amounts to torture, adding, quote, it's not acceptable to use threats of force-feeding or other types of physical or psychological coercion against individuals who've opted for the extreme recourse of a hunger strike, he said. A federal court ruled last week California prisons can force-feed prisoners deemed incapable of making medical decisions. At a rally for the hunger strikers in the Southern California city of Norwalk, the mothers of 2 prisoners spoke about their son's plight.
Right now, under federal government law, research chimpanzees are protected from being held in solitary confinement because they're defined as social beings and that it's detrimental to their mental and physical health. So how much more of a social being is my son, or is, you know, my friend's husband, or somebody else's son? I mean, a human being is the most social being that there is.
There's no need for that. There's no reason why they should be held in a cage 23 hours out of the day. I haven't held my son in 10 years. I haven't been able to touch him. I have nothing. And this has to stop. It really has to stop now. You know, because I won't lose my son. I will not lose my son.
At its peak, the California hunger strike included some 30,000 prisoners. Dozens are still taking part. The retail giant Walmart has announced it'll begin offering health insurance benefits to the partners of employees in same-sex unions in the United States. The policy change will take place next year. Walmart is the nation's largest private employer with some 1.3 million workers. And the nation is commemorating today's 50th anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where Dr. Martin Luther King gave his famous speech, I Have a Dream. President Obama will mark the anniversary with a speech today from the same spot as Dr. King at the Lincoln Memorial on the National Mall. Several African-American leaders will also deliver remarks, along with other guests, including former Presidents Bill Clinton and Jimmy Carter. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Nermeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world.